Good morning, everyone. I am Wanda Rogers, and we would like to welcome you to our Accommodating Employees with Mental Health Impairments. We're excited about this topic due to the fact that May is Mental Health Impairment Awareness Month. And so this is a topic that is of great interest, especially during this COVID time. So we would like to welcome you. A couple of housekeeping ideas. We will be sending out the video afterwards. We are recording it. We would, at the end, we will be having a Q&A. So we will welcome any questions that you have. Please just type them in the chat session. Also, I just want to take a minute and introduce myself. I am Wanda Rogers, as I said. I'm the Executive Director of Disability in Union County. We are one affiliate of 25 affiliates nationwide. Our organization drives the mission of disability inclusion forward by working with partners on the ground. And we are located in Evanston. I'll go ahead, Cedar, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Cedar Davis. I am the Executive Director of Cultivate Ability. We're really excited you're here. We're excited about this speaker series and partnering with our wonderful friends at Disability in Uintah County. Cultivate Ability is a nonprofit organization located in Jackson, Wyoming, and we foster disability inclusive workplaces through educational programs just like this. So we're really excited about this, and Wanda, I'll hit it back to you.
Please mark your calendars for June 2nd. We will have Beth Butler, who's the Executive Director of the Disability in North Carolina. She'll be talking about what HR and disability and inclusion leaders need to know. She'll be sharing some steps in corporate journeys and how to develop a disability inclusive culture. So we will be sending out additional information, but please mark your calendar for June 2nd.
And we'll be sure to put in the chat the link to register for that event as well. So without further ado, would love to introduce our guest speaker today, Melanie Wetzel from the Job Accommodation Work, also lovingly known as Jan. As the lead consultant of the cognitive neurological team, she specializes in learning disabilities, mental impairments, developmental disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, and brain injuries. So Melanie, take it away, and Wanda and I will check back in at the end here.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to provide a lot of information. I said to Cedar and Wanda, I hope it's not like getting hit with a fire hose, but since I have the opportunity, I want to make sure I can provide as much information as possible. So we're just going to start out talking about Jan a little bit. For those of you who may not be familiar, if we were in person, I would say, hey, raise your hand if you've heard of Jan, raise your hand if you've used Jan. So Jan was established in 1983 as a national free service. We're located in Morgantown, West Virginia, but we are a national free service. We are part of the Department of Labor. We specialize in job accommodations and employment provisions of the ADA. We assist in the interactive process, and that can be whatever step of the interactive process you might have a question about. We give targeted technical assistance. We provide comprehensive resources, and we maintain confidentiality. And that's really an important part because you can call us, you can do a chat, you can do an email, and you can be assured that your information remains confidential. And that way you're freer to look at your options and talk more openly. We communicate via telephone, chat, text, TTY, relay, email, Skype, and social networks. There's no way that you can't get a hold of Jan. We offer live and archive training like we're doing today. We have a training, and I'll show you that here in a minute. We have a training tab on our website, and we work as your partner in providing, helping make model employers. So here is a picture of our homepage, and up at the top there, the menu, the little white menu next to the Jan, you'll see it says A to Z. That is probably the most useful thing on our website. It's an A to Z listing. It's listed by disability, by limitation, by accommodation, and you can go in there and you can find a bipolar disorder. You can find mental health conditions in general. You can find depression and anxiety. If you go to by limitation, maybe you don't know the disability, but hey, we know this person's having difficulty with memory. So you can go to the limitation tab and look up memory, and they'll have a whole list of accommodations there with products that can help. We have a tab there for the ADA library. That's more information about the ADA than you will probably ever need, but there's good information there. That's where EEOC guidances are located. Then there's an accommodation search where you can type in a word or a term, and you can get all those publications and resources we have that are listed for that one topic. Now, let me go back to the A to Z. If you're looking under bipolar or you're looking under depression, you can go down to the bottom and you can find all that we have on our website that's related to that as well. Then you can go over to publications. We have over 200 publications that are disability related, also in the A to Z's by topic. So you can find publications that are listed like service animals or insurance or accommodations or disclosure by topic. Then the training tab there, you can find modules that we've recorded and archived webcasts that you may not have signed up for but want to watch later. And then resources. We have resources, state and local resources, all kinds of things. You can go in there and look for yourself. If you have difficulty finding what you're looking for, don't hesitate to contact us. You can contact us here where it says have questions about workplace accommodations, the blue box, ask us, we can help. You can click on that. We have a Jan on Demand email. You can just email us with your question, but the Jan on Demand email is a form that you can fill out, and it just assures that we get the information we need. I remember when I first started at Jan, one of the emails said, I'm having problems at work, can you help me? And I sent back, yes, probably, but I probably need a little bit more information. So I sent some general information, but it's always nice to have as much specific or detailed information as possible. And then we can get that detailed information back that you need in order to help you. At Jan, we work on teams. We have a motor team, cognitive neurological team. That's the team that I work with, sensory team. And then we also have entrepreneurship team who works with people interested in small businesses and self-employment. The cognitive team works with everything cognitive and neurological. That's all mental health conditions, sleep disorders, epilepsy, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities. Oh gosh, I'm going to draw a blank. Autism, brain injuries, anything. Sometimes we just get inquiries about cognitive impairment. Don't know what it is, except that it's a cognitive impairment. Sometimes we get questions and the employer or the person doesn't really know what the disability is. And that's okay too. We can talk about accommodations for some of the difficulties that that person is having. In fact, that's really the most important information we can have. The limitations are really more important. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. The limitations are really more important than the diagnosis because that's where the accommodations come in. Several people can have a diagnosis of depression, but they may have different needs on the job based on what their job is and what their level of depression is. Okay, so just so to be sure we're all on the same page, here's a definition of reasonable accommodations, and their changes or modifications to a job application process, to the work environment or the manner in which the position is customarily or normally performed that enables a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of the position, or that enable an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment as are enjoyed by other similarly situated employees without disabilities. And an individual has a disability under the ADA if he or she has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. Major life activities are things we do daily that sometimes we don't have to think much about. Breathing, walking, sitting, standing, thinking. Those are some examples. And it also includes bodily systems. So if you have like circulatory issues, your circulatory system, that counts too. If you have a record of such an impairment, which means maybe somebody who is doing fine on the job, has no issues right now, but they have had a diagnosis of mental health impairment, but they're doing great. Something may happen and their symptoms may be exacerbated. So they have a record of that impairment, even though you may not have known that because they're doing so well. Or someone is regarded as having an impairment. Now, you're not covered under the ADA for accommodations if your employer or someone regards you as having an impairment, but you can file a complaint if you feel like you've been mistreated, harassed, retaliated against because somebody thought you had an impairment. And that's why it's so important for employers to be careful and not to talk about somebody having a disability if they think they have a disability till they know for sure. And we're going to talk a little bit about that here in just a few minutes. Some common limitations that we see here at Jan for mental health, people with mental health conditions: panic, memory, learning, attendance issues, difficulty with organization, concentration, time management, sleep disturbances are often a big part of that. A lot of people take medication to help them sleep, and then sometimes the next day they may be groggy. Working effectively, interactions with coworkers, and then handling stress and emotions, managing that. So we're going to talk a little bit about disclosure. Disclosure is always a personal decision. People with mental health impairments can sometimes struggle with disclosure. Should I not? You know, there's stigma attached to my diagnosis. Do I need to let my employer know that? And we say it's always a personal decision, but if your disability, your medical condition is causing issues on the job with your performance or your conduct, then we would say it's time to disclose that to your employer. You don't want to wait till things get too far and it becomes too late. The earlier you disclose that, the earlier you get things worked out with accommodations, the better it is for you, the better it is for your employer. So you want to provide the nature of the disability. You want to provide the limitations or how the disability affects the capacity to learn and or perform the job effectively. And like I said a little bit earlier, that's really more important than the actual diagnosis, because that's where the accommodations come in. You can provide information about the accommodations you need in order to do the job. Sometimes people know exactly what they need. Sometimes people have no idea. They're in a new position or they've had a change in their medical condition and they really don't know what will help. And sometimes with mental health impairments, they can create, cognitive issues. And so sometimes people don't realize that they're not performing to their full ability. They're not performing the full job. And so they may not understand that they do need accommodations or that they do need to disclose. So why do you disclose? There are three main reasons to disclose. And the first is to ask for job accommodations. The majority of these slides in this session are going to be about accommodations, sample accommodation situations and solutions. So I'm not going to say too much about that. To receive benefits or privileges of employment. People with disabilities are entitled to the same benefits and privileges of employment that other employees that are similarly situated are entitled to as well. Those can be a lunchroom. Someone who uses a wheelchair can't access a second floor lunchroom in an old building that has no elevator. So they're entitled to that same type of lunchroom, break room. It can be a credit union. It can be exercise room. It can be training. Maybe somebody needs some accommodations for training. I'm going to have some examples here in just a minute. It could be like a retirement party or a birthday party or a summer picnic that the employer has. And then also to explain an unusual circumstance. So our first example here is Rhonda, and she has depression and needs to ask for the accommodation of a flexible schedule while she adjusts to new medication. She's having difficulty sleeping and waking up and has been late 3 days in a row. She's wary of disclosing her medical condition, but she doesn't want to get into disciplinary action either. So Rhonda discloses and provides medical documentation. Since her work doesn't depend on or affect others, her employer found no hardship in flexing her schedule as long as she gets her time in between the core business hours of 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Now, this worked great for Rhonda. It may not work for everybody. Some jobs, maybe a teacher, you need to be there at a certain time. You can't always come late and have the principal, stand in for you till you get there. So there may be other accommodations that are needed. Here we have an example, benefits and privileges of employment. Steve has PTSD and a brain injury, and he has difficulty attending large meetings where there are distractions of many people and lots of noise. And so allowing Steve to attend meetings by phone conferencing might be necessary to provide him with the same benefit of the information gained from the meetings that everyone else has access to, but in a more controlled way that is more accessible for him. And then here we have an unusual circumstance. Lena is an office employee who works on the first floor of the building. She's unable to use the stairs due to PTSD from an assault that took place in a stairwell. She doesn't need to disclose her inability to use the stairs right now because she's not been required to use the upper floors. Once the HR department moves to an upper floor, though, Lena may have to disclose both her PTSD and the inability to use the stairs in the event that the elevator is out of service. If and when the elevator is out of service and she needs to meet with the HR department, her appointment could be rescheduled or moved to a location on the first floor. So how do you disclose? The individual must let the employer know simply that an adjustment or a change at work is needed for a reason related to a medical condition. And the medical condition part of the information you give to the employer is important, because if you just say, hey, I'm having trouble getting to work on time, they may think it's because you're staying up too late or anything else that's going on, and they may not connect that with a disability and the need for an accommodation. You don't have to use any special language. You can use plain English. You don't have to mention the ADA, and you don't have to use the phrase reasonable accommodation. You can do that. We suggest that people put it in writing, and that way they have the documentation that they did disclose and ask for an accommodation. But it can be as simple as saying to your employer, hey, I need to talk to you. I'm having difficulty getting to work on time because of some medications I take for a medical condition. Can we talk about that? So who do you disclose to? You can do it verbally. There's nothing in the ADA that says it has to be in writing. A lot of employers have their own forms, but we would suggest putting it in writing. Like I said, we have a sample letter on our website. It can be very simple. And then you have that documentation that you did ask for that accommodation. It makes it a little bit more formal for the employer. Then there's no mistaking what you're asking for either. You can talk to your employer, your supervisor, a staff member, an HR representative, or another appropriate person. And if you have any kind of a handbook that might have directions, instructions, how to do that, the process, that might be a good thing to do. You can ask a supervisor. You don't have to share medical information with a supervisor. A lot of people want their supervisor to know they're having difficulty, but they don't want their supervisor to know what their medical condition is. And really only the person who handles the accommodation request needs to have that medical information, and it's highly confidential. The supervisor may be told, hey, there's the employee needs some accommodations, and what those accommodations might be, what the limitations are. It's having great difficulty with concentration, so we're going to talk about accommodations, but wouldn't need to know the medical condition. You could have a lot of trouble with concentration with a lot of different disabilities or medical conditions, and that way your supervisor doesn't know your medical history. And so your employer can require that you provide documentation when the disability is not obvious or when the need for accommodation is not obvious. So the EEOC, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They're the enforcing agency of the ADA. And they say that documentation must come from the appropriate medical professional. So who are those medical professionals? Who's appropriate? Well, it really depends on what the disability is or the medical condition. Medical doctors, a psychiatrist and psychologists for someone with a mental health impairment. You may provide information about your bipolar disorder from your family doctor, and your employer may say, hey, you know what? We think we need a little bit more specific information. Excuse me. We'd like to have some information from a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Nurses may be able to provide that. physical or occupational therapist if you have some motor issues and you're being seen by a therapist of that kind, a speech therapist. Vocational rehabilitation professionals can provide documentation, licensed mental health professionals. Some are able to diagnose mental health impairments, some are not, but they might be a really good person to provide information about accommodations. Sometimes what we hear is people spend very little time with a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but they go to a therapist, and the therapist really understands their condition and is working with them to help them. And so they might be really helpful in providing information about accommodations. And then educational professionals as well, if a disability is an intellectual disability or a learning disability or autism. So here we have a situation. Rico is a longtime university IT employee who discloses severe bouts of depression that have affected his ability to work the night shift. He requested his shift be changed to a day or evening one to help him better regulate his sleep. His manager is totally surprised because Rico has had no performance problems or issues of any kind. And I think that's important that, you know, a lot of individuals who have mental health impairments are able to manage their symptoms until they're not. And it could be any number of things. And we found here that during COVID, this whole, what, going on 14, 15 months now, it's created a lot of stress and anxiety for all of us. And so people with mental health impairments or mental health conditions have been affected a lot more severely in some cases, and sometimes never needed to disclose a disability until something happened, their job changed, their disability, something changed about their disability. So because the manager has no idea that the person had depression, never saw any indication of that, doesn't understand why that accommodation is needed, they can ask for the medical documentation that will provide the information as to why the accommodation is needed. The supervisor then takes a look at the schedules to see what can be done to assist Rico. And in this example, we have Allie who has PTSD and requests to bring her support dog to help with the upsets and stress that happen on a daily basis. Her employer asks for medical documentation that supports her request for accommodation and asks either for documentation of the training of the dog or a demonstration that the dog is trained and will not disrupt the workplace. They can ask for medical documentation that the person has a disability. So if they have an emotional supporting animal, they can provide information as to their mental health condition and accommodations that they might need. And then the employer can't demand that they have a certificate of training, because a lot of people train their own dogs. What they can demand is that the dog actually be trained to behave appropriately in the workplace. So if there is no certificate of training, then a demonstration can often be helpful. And an employer can say, hey, we'll do this on a trial basis and see how the dog works out. Heard from did a session yesterday, and one of the questions was the dog is lunging and growling at people. That is not a trained animal to have in a workplace. And so that would not be appropriate. Okay. So performance and conduct, I just want to talk a little bit about that. Employers can have the same performance and conduct standards for all employees, whether they have a disability or not. They can expect the same level of performance and conduct. The only difference is for employees with disabilities, they provide accommodations that help them meet those standards of performance and conduct. And although there's no standard time to disclose and ask for an accommodation, we would say, like I said earlier, you want to do it as soon as possible if you're having difficulty with performance or your behavior, your conduct is getting a little bit out of the norm, maybe, so the employer knows what's going on and you can work on that, getting a solution together before things go too far, because an employer does not have to excuse bad performance or inappropriate conduct that happens before they knew there was a disability involved. And some people don't want to disclose it, and they wait till the very last minute when they're being terminated, and that can be too late. So here we have an example. Pat's employer requests a meeting with her to talk about some recent performance issues. Pat is surprised. She didn't realize her performance was as low as the employer's stating. And I kind of mentioned that earlier. There are times when people that have cognitive issues aren't really aware that they're not working up to their performance. They're not really aware that there may be some job functions that they're not doing. And it's really good practice for the employer to come to them with that information. Hey, we need you to be up here. We need you to start completing those reports on time, or whatever the issue is, because it may be the first time that the individual really understands, hey, my performance is slipping. So Pat discloses that she has recurrent depression. She says she's finding it more and more difficult to concentrate and remember tasks. Her employee asks her what accommodations can help them work together to assist her in reaching her performance goals. And here we have one that's more about conduct. Susie's written up after two verbal warnings for inappropriate conduct. She's placed on a 30-day plan of improvement and warned that if the behavior doesn't stop within those 4 weeks, she'll be let go. Susie discloses her disability and asks for accommodations to help her in responding more appropriately to coworkers. The employer puts Susie's PIP or PIP, that's the performance improvement plan, on hold until they receive medical documentation and can put accommodations into place. But they do not rescind the discipline that occurred before the disability was known. Once accommodations are put into place, the employer starts the performance improvement plan. That's according to the EEOC. That's how that really should be done. Once the employer knows that a disability is involved and that's the reason for the misconduct or the performance issues, they really should try to get the accommodations in place before they evaluate the person going forward. So here we have Rita. Rita's a sales associate in a retail location who strikes another employee while on a break. When the store manager intervenes, Rita discloses that she has bipolar disorder and is under a lot of stress and anxiety due to a spouse's job loss. The employer doesn't ask anything about the disability, nor does he rescind the termination. The company policy states a zero tolerance for fighting. And this is a really good policy. If you have a zero tolerance, is to not get into information about the disability and decide later to terminate somebody. That can be construed as, well, we waited till we found out the person had bipolar and then we fired them. We waited until we found that they had a mental health impairment and then we terminated them. So it's best if they have a policy of zero tolerance that they stick with that policy. And that way it's fair across the board. Okay, now we're just going to talk about some different options for accommodations. And here's where a lot of different examples come into play. Oh, I've done it again. I'm sorry, getting a little trigger happy here. I apologize for that. Okay, so we're going to talk just real quickly about purchasing or modifying equipment or products. We have a lot of listing of products on our website. When you go to the limitations section, you look up person has limitations in memory. There'll be listings of different products for different needs. Here we have a task lamp that can be very helpful for people who with migraines or autism, maybe who have sensitivity, someone who's had a brain injury, who has sensitivity to the overhead lights. Excuse me. So they just need a task lamp to help them. The overhead lights are too bright. Next, we have a watch with a timer that can be set. That can be very helpful for people who need reminders of when to go to lunch or when to go on break, when to come back, when to take medication, when to clock in, when to clock out. Next, we have a notebook there. It's a smart pen, and it records the information on the pen. And it also, because it uses this specific paper, you can go back and tap on points that you've made on the paper, and then it will read out the recording at that time, what was said at that time. So that's really helpful. You don't have to write out all the notes. You can, somebody says, we've got 3 really important points here. You can write 1, 2, 3, and then it'll go back and you can hear the recording from that point. That's really good for people with executive functioning deficits who may find it difficult to take notes. And it's difficult to take notes. You have to listen and keep up and then write, anticipate what's being said next. Next there at the bottom, that first product is just a little pocket recorder that can be very helpful for people who need reminders, maybe listen to instructions over several times. directions. The next picture there is just it's not a wireless headset, it's a headset with a wire, but a wireless one works very well. And, if you spend a lot of time on the phone, you don't have to crimp your shoulder up to hold the phone. You can use your hands to type, you can get up and walk around. Gives you a lot more mobility and not a lot of wear and tear on the same muscles. And then lastly, there we have like an iPad, a tablet with apps, lots and lots and lots of apps. Lots of apps come out every day, but a lot of those can be helpful for people with disabilities. So here we have a situation with Joni, who's an administrative assistant, whose essential functions included taking and distributing notes from various meetings. She had difficulty listening, remembering what to write, and then keeping up with what was being said next. And so she was provided with a smart pen that records the meetings as she takes brief notes. This accommodation enables her to focus on listening to what's being presented in the meetings, while at the same time getting down that important information. Here we have Jose. Jose's a real estate agent who had difficulty keeping materials organized for his clients. He tried to organize the paperwork in different colored notebooks, one for each client, but was unable to keep track of them all, left them behind. He's trying to keep them in his trunk of his car, it was not working. Excuse me. So Jose's existing system was streamlined by using one large binder with colored tabs to separate and keep track of each client's specific paperwork, yet it was kept in one easily accessible location. He only had to keep track of that one notebook. And then a key in the front of the binder listed clients by color. So making the work site accessible, this is very important. Work site accessibility is usually triggered by an accommodation request from an employee. An employer is encouraged to make as many updates to their property as possible, but it's up to an individual to request accommodations that they might need for accessibility if it's not already in the building. That can be parking, certain types of parking. It can be a little threshold ramp for rooms that aren't level, thresholds that aren't level. It can be very difficult for people in wheelchairs, people who use rollators, or me, for instance. I can be sort of klutzy, and sometimes we're not paying attention, and different heights in the flooring can cause real problems for people. And then that last picture is an automatic door opener for people who may have difficulty opening up traditional doors. So here we have an example of a parts sorter in a distribution center who had difficulty standing for his shift with only a 30-minute lunch and a short afternoon break. His work became sloppy in the afternoons due to his fatigue. So he was provided with both an anti-fatigue mat, and that's a thick spongy mat that helps his back and legs, and then a stand lean stool that allowed him the ability to work in an upright position while his weight rested on the padded seat. We hear from people who say their employers expect them to be standing up. They can't be seated. And this stool is really a good alternative because it gives you the appearance that you're standing up, that you're not seated, but yet it takes the weight off of your legs and your feet. Here's another situation where Marcy asked for a reserved parking space, at least in the winter, when she left work in the dark. She has anxiety and panic from a previous assault in a dark parking garage. So her manager secured a space for her so that she could park near the building where the lights were brighter. He also had the night security guard walk her to her car when it was dark. Job restructuring. Now, job restructuring can mean many things. It doesn't mean removing essential functions. An employer is free to remove essential functions if they want to, if they feel they need to do that. Sometimes they'll do that temporarily. They don't have to remove essential functions. What they can do is look at removing marginal functions that might give somebody more time and energy to do the essential functions. Or they can change the essential functions, like how they're done or when they're done. Here we have a help desk employee's main job functions were troubleshooting the problems of other staff members. He was highly competent in solving problems, but became impatient, rude, and disrespectful to coworkers who contacted him for assistance. So a new policy was instituted, which allowed him to take requests for help by email instead of in person or by phone. So his job was restructured a little bit so that he didn't have to do the in-person contacts with people. He could take the requests by phone or by email, and that reduced the stress he had when he interacted with his coworkers. This enabled him to keep his behavior and emotions in check. And you can tell by the picture, he's just way happier. But the bonus here is that then the employer had a better record of what was going on, especially by email. And I think they ended up deciding to do them all by email. And that way they had record of those reports coming in of who needed help and what the issue was, when the issue was solved and how it was solved. So it was an accommodation that ended up really helping the employer too. Here we have an employer that required all employees to work overtime. Bo, an employee with bipolar disorder, asked to be excused from overtime because of fatigue and exacerbation of symptoms. Well, his employer denied his request, stating that overtime is an essential function. And if you're hired knowing that you need to work overtime, everybody's expected to work overtime, that can be considered an essential function. But the process shouldn't stop there. An employer should ask about alternative accommodations. You need to work the overtime. How do we help you do that? Do you need more breaks? Do you need different types of breaks? Do you need a standing stool? Do you need ergonomic equipment? What can we do to help you so that you're not as fatigued, so that you can do the job? And that's just continuing the interactive process. So modifying a schedule, allowing leave time. This is probably one of the most requested accommodations for people with mental health conditions. I mean, we found on our team, modifying a schedule can be anything that works for the employee, as long as it works for the employer. That can be having a flexible schedule. I come in at 8 every day, but when I have difficulty in the mornings, I come in at 9 or I come in at 10. And instead of working 8 to 4, I work 9 to 5 or 10 to 6. And employers can allow that. Some jobs may not be ideal for that. It could be flexible where it changes from day to day. Some employers allow people that flexibility. Sometimes it doesn't work. So they want it to be a more set schedule. So instead of coming in at 8, let's have you come in at 9 every morning. We'll allow you that hour to, get yourself together if it's grogginess from medication, whatever. It can be having more breaks that are lesser time. It can be having fewer breaks with more time. Employers don't have to pay people with disabilities, have to allow people with disabilities more paid breaks than other employees, but they can look at how do we restructure those breaks, or can the person come in early, half an hour early, 15 minutes early, stay 15 minutes late in order to have an extra break during the day. And then allowing leave time. And leave under the ADA can be in chunks of time. You need 2 weeks off. You have an exacerbation of symptoms, you need 2 weeks off. Could be maybe a month off, your medication's being changed, and you need time to, your body needs time to regulate to that new medication. Excuse me. It could be an hour, 1 day a week for medical appointments or for counseling. And it's whatever works for the employer. They can provide as much leave as the employee needs till it causes a hardship for them. So here we have a situation. As a result of severe anxiety and a driving phobia, Ben is having difficulty getting to work on time. So Ben's employer flexed his schedule in order to accommodate the variations in public transportation schedules. Here where we are, it's pretty rural. There's not a lot of public transportation. So people with disabilities may have a real difficulty getting to work on time at a set time. And if that can be flexed, that's really an effective accommodation. Here's a situation where Sally's returning to work after a somewhat lengthy hospital stay for inpatient mental health treatment. She's accommodated with a part-time schedule of working 4 to 6 hours Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, with Tuesdays and Thursdays off for therapy and recuperation. She plans to increase her schedule, transitioning back to full-time as she's able. Now, the employer may be able to do this for a little bit of time, may be able to do it for 6 months. It depends on the situation. And that's why it's really important for employers to look at accommodations on an individualized basis. It might depend on the job. And I know that may not sound fair, but if there are more people in one department where those other people can pick up some of this person's work when they're only working part-time, it's not going to be as much of a hardship as someone in a department where there may be only 2 employees and it's payroll or something like that. It can also be seasonal. We hear from retailers who say, during the summer and off times, we can offer a lot of different accommodations than we can during the holidays when we're open late hours and we need all hands on deck. So it depends on a lot of different things. And it's really important to look at each case individually. All right, modifying policies. There's what's called a modified workplace policy under the ADA that says an employer can change a policy for someone with a disability that they don't change for others. That can be an attendance policy. It could be a uniform policy, could be policy about having drinks at your workstation. Somebody needs a drink because medication tends to dehydrate them, so they need to have a drink during the day. Okay, here we have a situation. Tad's an employee with PTSD who had difficulty with consistent and dependable attendance due to the exacerbation of symptoms with the approaching 10-year anniversary of the traumatic event. So his employer modified its no-fault policy that states employees who accrue more than 7 days of absences are automatically terminated. And that no-fault policy can really get an employer in trouble if they apply it across the board and don't ever look at if a person has a disability and needs a change of policy. Do they need an accommodation? Let's say someone who has depression has been hospitalized. They may need more than 7 days of absences in a year. That's really not very many for someone who has a disability. People with seizures sometimes need to miss work, and those days could accrue and really sort of punish them for having that disability. And so that policy can be changed if it doesn't create a hardship for the employer to provide those absences. So here we have a situation, excuse me, Marguerite experienced frequent panic attacks and requested to bring her support animal to work. She took public transportation daily, and the dog provided security for her on her way to and from the office. So the employer modified its no animal policy and accommodated Marguerite by allowing the service dog in the workplace. This is a really good example here, and I'm going to talk about temporary or trial accommodations and how helpful they can really be. So Zeke has not worked in his current job for the amount of time required to telework. After a very stressful episode in the office, he asks if he could work from home temporarily until he can regulate his symptoms. And his supervisor was willing to allow him to work from home initially for 2 weeks to evaluate his effectiveness and then determine at that point if it could continue to be an effective accommodation. An employer can always provide trial or temporary accommodations, and like telework, we've had a really good trial period of telework due to COVID. We've seen where a lot of people can work from home, where it's not been as helpful for some. But if an employer is really not sure if an accommodation is going to work, they can offer that as a trial or temporary accommodation to see how it's going to work. They sometimes feel like, well, if we approve this, then we're going to be locked in. And with a temporary or trial, they're not going to be locked in. So providing readers, interpreters, and job coaches can be accommodations. Here we had Millie had a successful history of working in retail, but was returning to work after being out for many years due to major depression. She was working part-time and requested a job coach to help her. She felt that her people and her interpersonal skills were lacking because she'd been home for so long. She didn't have much confidence in herself or her abilities. Well, Millie's employer saw no problem in providing her with a job coach. Once Millie had successfully acclimated to the job, the employer provided a mentor who would be available to guide her and answer questions, much like the job coach had done. This is one of my favorite examples here. This is Sean, a country club employee, found it difficult to get motivated in the mornings and initiate his job tasks. Extended training on how to do the tasks along with a task list were not successful motivators. So the employer noticed a friendship that had developed between Sean and a pro shop employee. The pro shop employee described their relationship as a grandfatherly one. He began to mentor Sean by doing periodic checks on him during the mornings. The response was very positive. Sean worked successfully, seemingly eager to please his new friend. Now, reassignment is an accommodation of last resort. That only means that the employer really should try to accommodate the person in their current position first. And if that's not possible, then look at reassignment. If the employer and the employee both agree that reassignment is the best option, then hey, go ahead and look for reassignment. What that means is the employer looks for an open position that the employee is qualified for. They don't have to create a position. They don't have to bump someone else out of one. In this example, we have an employee who delivered meals locally. He asked for a change in position when the kitchen where the meals were prepared was being remodeled. The temporary kitchen was in the city where he was unable to drive. So the driver was accommodated with reassignment to a painting and light construction crew that was helping with the renovations at the kitchen. Since he would only be required to drive to the center where the kitchen was located, the driver was able to continue working with no problems. And here we have an RN with nearly 20 years of experience in a veterans hospital, was having great difficulty working in the emergency and critical care units due to an increase in symptoms when dealing with trauma. He asked for the accommodation of a reassignment. We've seen a lot of that with COVID. I'm sure you've seen on the news, how some of the medical care workers are they're just exhausted. It's just too traumatic for them. So the hospital HR department worked with the employee to determine positions he was qualified for that were open or would be soon. And so together they ranked the positions in the order of which were best suited to the employee. He was able to choose among 3 different positions in the veterans healthcare system. And this last example here is an employee was having difficulty working in a busy central banking office. He managed a large staff of workers, provided customer service, and had daily oversight of the office. So after meeting consistently with the supervisor, it was determined that he would be the ideal manager to fill a recent opening in a smaller and less busy branch office. The employee maintained his salary and the responsibilities of his leadership role. Now, I was going to stop here at this time to make sure we had time for questions. I will say that when you get the PowerPoint presentation, there are some more examples. I think I have time probably to go over one more. And this is a really good one too, because sometimes people with mental health conditions, one of the biggest issues at work is absences. They sometimes miss a lot of work. So in this example, due to an anxiety disorder, Jake has missed 2 to 3 days per week for the last month, causing a hardship for his employer. You can imagine he's been there half the time. So Jake's employer works with him to provide accommodations that will reduce the stress he feels while on the job, enabling him to get to work more frequently. Now, there are times when people have anxiety disorders that there's no, and I'm not a doctor, I'm just going by what we hear from people and employers. There's no real cause for the anxiety, so it may be difficult to accommodate that. But what's really important here is to, again, look at this on an individualized basis. Talk to Jake, work with him, find out what causes him stress, because what causes me stress and what causes you stress are going to be 2 different things. So you need to find out, the employer needs to find out exactly what's causing the stress in Jake's job every day so that they can work with him to accommodate it so that he can get to work more frequently and not create a hardship. Okay. It's now a good time to stop and go for questions. Do we have any questions that we want to answer?
Yes, there's one question that says, what qualifies as a hardship?
Oh, that's a really good question. That depends on a lot of different things. It basically, the simplest, most definition of hardship would be something is too expensive, it's too disruptive, or would change the nature of the business. For instance, one example comes to mind. was a person who worked on a assembly line, cars. I think it was cars, but anyway, had anxiety, needed these breaks, not scheduled breaks, but breaks when she was feeling anxious. Well, the employer could not provide just breaks whenever she's feeling anxious because they had to shut down the whole production line. That would be considered too disruptive. So they worked with her to work out scheduled breaks. I think they eventually worked to find her a reassignment to where she could have a position where she could have breaks, which wouldn't affect everybody in that section of the assembly line. But if something is too expensive, and that's an overall big expense. If it's a mom and pop grocery store that has 15 employees, they wouldn't be able to, provide it as expensive of accommodations as bigger grocery store chains, Walmarts, those kind of things. And then if it changes the nature of the business, that's something that they don't have to provide either. And that's kind of on a case-by-case basis as well.
The second question is, are small businesses exempt from providing reasonable accommodations?
Well, if you have 15 or more employees, then you're covered by the ADA, which means that yes, you would provide accommodations that don't cause a hardship. And like I said, if you have 15 employees, you might not be able to provide the extensive accommodations or the expense of some certain accommodations as a bigger employer would. But if you have fewer than 15 employees, that goes on a state-by-state basis, what your threshold might be. Some states, you have to provide accommodations for people if you have 2 or more employees or 5 or more employees. So you want to look at your state civil rights agencies, your state laws to find out what that threshold might be.
Well, one question that I have, Melanie, is employers, when I work with employers, their question is, what is the best way to have their employees come forward and disclose their disability? They're willing to help and accommodate, but sometimes employers are hesitant, especially when it comes to mental health issues.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things is if employees see that there's an open and kind of honest relationship, they're more willing to come forward. Sometimes employees will say, there's no way I'm going to disclose. I saw what happened to my coworker when he disclosed and it was not pretty. And so if the employees see that going on, they're not going to be willing to disclose and ask for help. So when they see employers being more cooperative and working with employees, providing accommodations, they are going to be more willing. Another thing that the employer can do is to keep up with people and ask. If they see they're having difficulty, ask about it. They don't want to assume somebody has a mental health impairment, but they can say, hey, we've noticed that you're having difficulty getting your reports in on time. How can we help you with that? Because you really need to be doing that. We've noticed, you've been late 3 days in a row. What's going on? How can we help you with that? And it gives the employee the opening then to disclose that. And sometimes it brings to the employee's attention that, hey, I'm not doing as well as I thought I was doing. So I really do need to talk to my employer about the difficulties I'm having.
I think that's excellent advice. And I know that next month we're having Beth Butler talk about how to develop an inclusive culture within their workplace so people feel more comfortable with coming forward and talking about that. But it really does matter what the culture of your workplace is like.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we hear from people who were fired because they were terrified to disclose a disability because they felt that they were going to be retaliated against or, whatever, because they felt like they'd seen that in other people, or because they came from another job where they weren't treated well once they disclosed. So they made that decision not to disclose in the future job, where the future job, maybe it would have been a lot better situation for them to disclose. So yeah, in any way that employers can stress that they want to help people, and a lot of times we talk to employers who will say, oh, we provide accommodations pretty much to whoever asks, if they're quick and easy ones. We don't even ask for medical documentation. Hey, you need a lumbar support pillow? Hey, we provide that to you. But if they need a new chair that's expensive, then they would get the medical documentation. So I think when the employees see, hey, so-and-so asked for a lumbar pillow and he got that, then I'm not going to be afraid to ask for something I need, because it seems like they're willing to provide what we need.
Melanie, it looks like we have one more question in the chat that came through.
Okay.
We have an employee who stated he needed an accommodation for a mental illness and has not provided us with the medical documentation to verify his illness or what he needs. This has been going on months, and we have tried to help him, but his performance and attendance is struggling.
Okay, well, the EEOC would say that you don't have to provide accommodations if you don't have medical documentation, if the disability and the reason for the accommodations is not known. So you don't have to provide those. You might want to have a conversation with the employee as best you can. And I know sometimes people who are having mental health issues, it's difficult to talk to them and help them understand, we really need to get this information from your doctor. Have you been to the doctor? Can we help you get an appointment? Is there an EAP, employee assistance program, that you could send the employee to that might be able to help get him a referral and get him to a doctor quicker? Are there accommodations that can be put into place that are simple, that you can do without the medical documentation? I mean, if the employer sees the employee's struggling, there may be some things to do that can help him. If it's inappropriate conduct, you can always, or if there's any fear of safety, for the person's safety or the safety of anyone else, they can put an employee on leave until they get that medical information. But that's not a common occurrence. A lot of times it's just people with mental health conditions. If they haven't seen their doctor, sometimes it's hard for them to get motivated to do that. And so I think the employer having that conversation, we really want to help you. Here's what we need. We need information from your doctor. How can we help you get that? Can we make an appointment for you? Can we help you? And I don't know that employer really has to go that far, but you want to be sure that you make a good faith effort to accommodate in any way that you can help an employee understand how important that information is and how much you want to help them, but your hands are tied without that information.
Well, it looks like we have one more question. Can you talk more about having the same performance expectations for employees of differing abilities? All people excel or struggle with different elements of any given job. How do we support employees with impairments while making it feel fair to all employees? And then it was said, sorry if this is an insensitive question, which it isn't. This is a good question.
It is a good question. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with accommodations is employers are afraid that people are going to say, well, you're giving him special treatment because you're allowing him to do this or you're allowing her to do that. And I think I've mentioned like report writing twice. Okay, so let's say that the issue is you have reports that you have to write and they have to be done on the 1st of the month. You're not getting yours done. They have to be done on the 1st of the month. How can we help you do that? Do you need more help with organization? Do you need a sample report? Is it possible to have a sample where you can just fill in certain lines? I think employees need to understand that you have to perform at this level. We'll get calls from employees who say, but I have a disability, I can't do that. Well, if you can't do the job with accommodations, then you're not qualified for that job. Maybe a reassignment is something that you want to look at, because an employer can expect to have that same level of performance. And you look at, can we get a job coach in to help them? Would a mentor help? Somebody who's on the job that's had this job or has the job, who could give pointers to the person, could help them get organized. Could they sit with somebody for a day, kind of job shadow, or for a couple hours, maybe even, and see how somebody else does the job? Maybe they're having difficulty with getting organized. There are a lot of people who have no organizational skills. They spin their wheels like in the mornings, like I can't get started. I don't know how to get started. And so maybe having just a checklist can help. Here's what you do first. Here's what you do second. Here's what you do next. A list of priorities can help with that. And then it's up to the employer to determine, and this can be difficult, to determine how many accommodations and how long do we allow this? I've talked to people who had an employee who cannot do the job, who has not done the job, and they've tried every accommodation possible for like 18 months or 2 years. And I think that's probably going way beyond, above and beyond the ADA. I mean, you want to make a good faith effort. You want to make sure that you've tried a different variety of accommodations that will help. But you can also look at, you know, how much has the person's performance increased with the use of these accommodations. And if you've done everything possible, and if you have questions, contact us at Jan. You know, if you're not sure what accommodations or what that process is, please contact us. You can call that 800 number and leave a message, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible, or the Jan on Demand, or the chat. The live chat is, and that's the quickest way to get an answer, is the chat, because there are people on that live chat. But we might be able to help you think of some accommodations that you haven't thought of, and just talk through some of those situations. Because it can be a hardship for an employer to have an employee working who's not doing the job, is only doing maybe 50% of the job. Who else is doing it? Someone else picking that up, is a supervisor picking that up. And so those are all different things to look at. A lot of times we just see people just really mismatched in a job. It's not a job that works well for their abilities and for their limitations.
Right. Well, thank you, Melanie, for sharing this information on accommodating employees with mental health issue. It was very valuable. I love the stories and then the solutions that I think really helps us kind of think things through. Also, thank you to our participants. We are seeking your input for future topics for webinars, so please fill out the survey that we'll be sending to you. Also, the SHRM credit code will be sent to you along with the recording of this session. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Melanie, for that great presentation. And
You're welcome.
And everyone, enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you for having me.